Welcome to Lou Palumbo's Between the Lines, problem solving for our future. Lou.
My name is Lou Palumbo. This is Between the Lines. We are plagued with rather controversial issues today, some of great significance. The message behind this show deals with the future of our children, what's actually in their best interests, clearly not in the best interest of our media, our elected officials, and anyone in this society who's not plugged into the importance of our children. Our guest today is Paul Boxer. He's a professor in the Department of Psychology at Rutgers University-Newark, where he also directs the Social Development Research Program and currently holds funding from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention to study how youth become involved in gun violence. He is an expert on the development and management of aggressive behavior and is currently serving on the expert panel for a national school safety and violence risk assessment project. Mr. Boxer is also part of a specially appointed commission from the International Society for Research on Aggression that prepared a report on youth violence in the wake of the high school shooting in Parkland, Florida. We want to thank him for joining us again today for the second time. I do want to remind the audience that we are sponsored by Instacart and Buzzsprout. We happen to use both of them. In fact, the Buzzsprout is the platform for this podcast. And, we had a very interesting exchange with Paul last week. And the interesting part of the conversation with him is that not only does he speak to the problem, but he lends to the solution, which is a real departure from what's going on today in the country. We have a lot of people pointing fingers, not many people pointing how to resolve these issues, whether it's the border, crime in our cities, our foreign policies, our economy. We have no answers being given to us as to how to get these genies back in their bottles. So he's solution born, which is very important, which was the impetus to asking him to come back for a second time. I want to get into it with him a little bit today about, of course, further discussion regarding the mental health of our youth and why they're so prone to violence, a certain demographic. I also want to speak to him about the overall mental health of the country. And I do want to talk to him a little bit about gun legislation because they intersect in his area. I want to remind everyone also, I just mentioned the borders, which I reinforce every time I speak because we have a problem there. I know it's not the priority in the country today. Everybody's concerned about the economy. We put our hand in your pocket. We have your undivided attention. But among other things going on with drug trafficking, there's also trafficking of human beings. And two gentlemen in particular, Frank Smith and Tony Sparks, who coordinate the efforts of Phantom Rescue, are intimately involved in the interdiction of this practice. I think it would be worth your while to delve into a little bit about this Phantom Rescue. And my understanding now is that Mr. Boxer may be ready, so I think we're going to go to him as soon as we're able to. First thing I want to say is thank you for coming back, Paul.
Sure.
I mentioned in the introduction the impetus to that request is the fact that not only are you able to identify, quantify, and speak to intelligently the problem we're dealing with our children, but you offer remedy, which is really a deviation from what we normally do. We're in a culture where we point fingers, and we very seldom ask how to get out of these situations we're in. So I just want to ask you what your perception is of the overall mental health of the country in general, if you want to speak to that.
That's a big question, Lou. Well, we know that things like suicidality among young people especially has been increasing. Kids' reported rates of anxiety and depression, those rates have been increasing as well in recent years. A lot of it, actually I shouldn't say a lot of it. So to some measurable degree, apparently seems to relate to experiences during the COVID pandemic and the associated lockdowns. I don't think that, it's hard to make a blanket statement like this, but I don't have the sense that overall our mental health as a nation is all that great. I think we're struggling in a lot of ways. And when I say we, I'm trying to include everybody. I think there's folks who are, let's say at the top of the income ladder who have some challenges, and certainly there are folks all the way down the ladder all the way down who are experiencing some challenges as well. So I do think that we're struggling. I think we're in a very difficult era right now that poses a lot of different kinds of challenges in a lot of different ways.
Clearly, I'm not clinically backgrounded as well as you are to speak to these issues. A lot of what I draw from are my instincts and intuition. which are predicated on experience. But I agree with your observations here. See, that's why I asked you the question, Paul, because I sense that this problem with our children, which is something that clearly needs to be addressed, it goes beyond that a little bit, and it lends itself to the stimulus that we're being subjected to. That's how I feel about this thing. So the next thing I do want to ask you about is, in a very general sense, what the hell is going on with our young kids today and this propensity towards gun violence, that demographic?
Again, big question, lots of possibilities. First, I want to make one observation around this issue. I've been thinking a lot about our conversation from last time. And I've been thinking a lot about the fact that since what happened in Texas happened, I've written a piece for the conversation. I think you probably came across that. I've been interviewed by a couple of different journalists who are writing stories about, how to handle this in terms of solutions and going forward. And it occurred to me that I only get outreach from journalists, folks like you, when we have these big, high-profile mass shootings. Unfortunately, that happens too often. But at the same time, in between these kinds of incidents, there's plenty of gun violence happening in the streets, in our cities and rural communities, fairly constantly, or at least consistently. And, it's a shame, I think, that the only time the national media or lots of us as a national community turn our attention to the problem of guns and gun violence is when we have these horrific, tragic shootings that are, still fairly rare in relative terms, but, pale in comparison to some extent to the frequency of what's happening every day in terms of everyday sorts of gun violence. So, I'm glad we're having this conversation. I hope it's a conversation that other people like me and other people like you will keep having on a more frequent basis as we start talking about the kinds of solutions that we know are out there. In terms of what's happening with kids and why there's so much violence or the perception of violence or why we seem to have this struggle, I think it's like some of the issues we talked about last time where, kids are really dealing with things on all fronts, right? So they're dealing with the stresses of what was perpetrated as a function of COVID. They're dealing with the stresses of, certainly what's been happening economically in our country. There's a lot of trickle-down research suggesting there are trickle-down kinds of effects when parents are stressed out by economic issues and stressed out by joblessness or changing jobs or their jobs not paying them enough or being able to be comfortable. That kind of stress trickles down into the ways in which those adults parent their kids, how they relate to each other. It creates a stressful home environment. There's lots of different possibilities or opportunities for kids to experience that kind of stress themselves. So, add to that thinking about what the future might look like. I know there's been a lot of research or increasing research on young people around what they think about things like climate action, what they think about things like global unrest in the world. In some respects, although there's a lot of good things in life, of course, I think kids are well aware or increasingly aware, thanks to social media and other ways they can get information, of what some of the stakes are right now for the future. And some of it's pretty grim.
Paul, part of my belief in life is that very seldom is there what we call single causality. I think what's happening with our children is a cumulative product, and this is just me spitballing. Again, you're the expert here. Failed parenting, a lot of wrong stimulus messages from Hollywood, for example, and the video games, bullying, the social media aspect in which they live, the fact that these children have been robbed of their childhoods. I've told you before, I was raised in the 50s and 60s as a child. This is not the America I know. The stimulus wasn't there. And we're speaking to exactly what's triggering them. And I have to say this. The reason I asked you with that leading question about the country overall is because I think we're all suffering from bad stimulus. I think you'll agree with that. The question is for you now is, how do we offset this? What are the tools we can use, Paul, to try to get the kids back on track, so to speak, and even help the overall mental health of the culture, which personally I've watched it decline. I think we took our eye off the ball. We became obsessed with things that are not as critically important. Money is, of course, the key to this whole discussion. What cars we drive, the recent generation of phone, your flat screen TV, your vacation, all the things that are really not that important at the end of the day. They're things you want, but they're not things you need. So I want to hit you with that question: is how are we going to get this back on track, buddy?
It's a great question, and I'm going to stay within my own sort of parameters of expertise on this. And let me talk about mental health for kids. Obviously, we're talking about other kinds of problems in the world, There's other folks in other disciplines who might think differently about those issues. But about mental health and kids' mental health, I think there's no question that we have to dramatically improve kids' access to high quality, effective mental health services. I think it has to be easy to get those services to kids who need it. I think the services have to be available, universally, in terms of parents who might want to reach out and find those services for their kids, or teachers or school administrators who want to bring those services to bear on kids in classrooms or in school buildings. I think we have a real problem in terms of, let me back up for a second. I think there's lots of mental health services out there. Kids can find counselors, they can talk to counselors in schools, et cetera. The number of people who are providing mental health services is much larger than the number of people who are providing mental health services that our science, psychological science, would say are effective mental health services. I think it's much more difficult to ensure that we're connecting kids with effective mental health services. And by that, I mean services that are based on research and evidence showing, improvements as a result of taking part in those kinds of interventions. So I think across the board, we need to do much better in terms of funding mental health services in schools, in terms of increasing the accessibility of high quality, best practice kinds of approaches to kids across the board in communities and in schools or wherever they might access services. And just in general, working towards taking away, I think, some of the stigma associated with seeking mental health help and making it easier for kids and adolescents and parents and families, et cetera, who believe that they need those services to get the services that will help them.
Yeah, I'm if I follow you correctly, just to synopsize this, I think we're looking for funding and mechanism, for people to go to. And I think you're right, Paul. I think if there is more of that available, to where if people say experience some type of deviation in behavior with their child, they have a resource to go to, which I think what I'm hearing from you is it's not there. Yeah. And that's a big problem. There's no question. I don't want to take you down too many paths that are not directly aligned to your areas of study. I do want to ask you this, Paul, just for the purpose of the edification of the listener, just give us a little bit about your educational background.
Sure. So I have a bachelor's degree in psychology that I got from Williams College. From there, I worked for a couple of years and then pursued my PhD in clinical psychology from Bowling Green State University, which is a program that's accredited by the American Psychological Association. When I completed my PhD, I spent a couple of years sort of as a postdoctoral researcher, trainee at the University of Michigan. And since then, I've been in academics. I worked at the University of Michigan, the University of New Orleans, and now at Rutgers University in Newark.
So we should be calling you Dr. Boxer.
You're welcome to call me that. You can also call me Paul. That's fine.
No, I think it's appropriate. I think it's
prefer.
Appropriate. And I mentioned this to the higher ups in this, Lloyd Molander and company, and I said you were a PhD, and I just wanted to confirm it so people do understand your level of accomplishment educationally. Let me ask you this, and this is not meant to be a tricky question, but it's a tangential discussion about gun control, for example. Obviously, we need some gun management in the country, but I think, and this is just my opinion, that the common denominator to the mass shooting is the mental illness, that the country chirped along for over 225 years without these incidents that are now occurring on a regular basis. And I do want to, before I forget, I want to comment on your observation about the shootings, the violence in our inner cities, which are not the same discussion as the mental illness issue. The mental illness issue is a heavy lift. The issue in the inner cities, Paul, is an enforcement issue. If we decide one day we're going to reestablish boundaries and consequences, we can offset what's going on in these inner cities in a heartbeat. I witnessed it in the 70s and the 80s, in particular in New York. But I want to go back to this discussion about, everybody now jumping on this bandwagon about pointing the finger at the firearm. As I said, it was in the country for well over 200 years, and suddenly, post-April 20, 1999, Columbine, right, we're off and running. And I ask people the following: did the gun change or did the culture change? And for whatever reason, there seems to be some level of reluctance with our elected officials to speak to this issue truthfully. And, I say this to people who embrace the Second Amendment. I don't know what your position is on the Second Amendment. You're free to volunteer it, but I support it. I understand its impetus. I understand where the Founding Fathers were going. We're witnessing it in real time in the Ukraine, concerns about tyranny and foreign invaders, and the way or the mechanism to keep the country free, quote unquote. These were legitimate concerns. But I do think it's time to give ground and start to come to some type of sensible regulation that would lend itself to screening before we start to give people deadly weapons. So, it's just, I'd be curious to know your position on this, what you think yourself.
Sure. Well, I'm no legal scholar, so I won't comment on the Second Amendment. What I will say is this. I think if we're talking about, and I just took a look, what was it, maybe Thursday or Friday, there was an article suggesting, that maybe some of the players in the Senate are coming to terms on some sort of bipartisan structure for moving forward on gun legislation, but I'm not sure it's strong enough. But I know they're nowhere near anything finalized yet anyway, so maybe it's too soon to even talk about that. But I do think that if we're going to talk about solutions, maybe we come at it from the perspective of trying to think about, well, whether we're dealing with gun owners or non-gun owners, whether we're dealing with police or civilians, what are some of the common principles across the board that we could support here? So based on what we know about these mass shootings, based on what we know about street crime, what are some of the things that we would support? Well, I think one easy question is, well, do we believe it would be important, for example, to keep guns completely out of the hands of children and adolescents, right? So can we come to some sort of common agreement on some kind of age cutoff for who can access a firearm in everyday life?
Now, I want to hold you with that thought, if I may,
Sure.
Paul, because we're going to go to a quick break,
Okay.
and I'm going to come right back to you, and I want to continue in that discussion about who we prevent from having access to this, because I have an interesting observation that's really driven by a certain demographic in a certain region of the country. We're going to be right back with you. I have Dr. Paul Boxer with me, Ph.D., and professor teaches at Rutgers University-Newark. We'll be right back, guys. Instacart, another interesting concept. You can go to your favorite grocery stores, sign on to their application without leaving your home, the comfort of your home. Just pick out the items you'd like. They'll assign a personal shopper for you and deliver them to the point that you would like them delivered to. Another great concept, very user-friendly, and I'll be honest, we use it also. It's very effective, and they're very, very good. They're very on point. We're back, and I have with me today a gentleman, Dr. Paul Boxer. He is a professor at Rutgers University-Newark, and we're having a conversation about a culture, to be very candid with you. And his real area of expertise or focus deals with the mental health issues with our young people and his propensity towards gun violence. The thing I did want you to finish was your thought before I rudely interrupted you because of our producers.
So just talking about some of the commonalities that we all might be able to support. So some kind of age cutoff for the extent for allowing kids to access firearms. Should it be 18? Should it be 21? Certainly, if it was 21 in Texas, we wouldn't even be talking about what happened in Texas a couple of weeks ago, because that kid bought those weapons on his 18th birthday. So had the age been 21 in Texas, he wouldn't have accessed them. We might not be having this conversation right now, Lou. Second thing is, do we believe that it's important to keep guns away from individuals who pose real, quantifiable, possibly imminent, but it's some maybe a little less than that, but some realistic threat to commit violence in some way with those firearms? So red flag laws, better background checks, broader screenings, looking into more detailed kinds of factors. Do we believe that's important? I mean, I think these aren't like complicated policy points, actually. Age cutoffs and deeper background checks and better screenings and red flags, that kind of thing. I think these are things that we could easily support, even in communities or states where there's more of a culture that supports different gun use in different ways. But one of the retorts I always hear when I'm talking with colleagues and friends about this kind of thing is, well, we can't. The laws aren't going to stop the criminals, from using guns. And okay, well, that's fine. So in that case, individuals who can pass those background checks, who don't have histories of being criminals, who don't pose risks of behaving violently, they can still go ahead and access some firearms, and we wouldn't necessarily have to worry about them.
Yeah, can I just say one thing to you, Paul, real quick? I may have mentioned to you that my mother was from Arkansas, her family.
Yes.
And, so I have a familiarization and a comfort level with the southern United States for obvious reasons. And I come from the Northeast. We're not really a gun-friendly region of the country, comparatively speaking, to the South, for example, or Texas, which is our Southwest, right? They cut their teeth on fishing rods and firearms. They bird hunt with their dads at 10 and 12 and 14 years old. What I think we need to do, and this is part of the compromise, is start to separate these weapons based on their intrinsic development and lethality. Obviously, we ain't bird hunting with a high-capacity semi-automatic Glock pistol that holds 33 rounds, folks. And you're not going to use an AR-15 that holds 30 rounds or as much as a 100-round magazine it's called a Beta Mag. They use them in the military. But there is another interesting point I want to make, and it deals with 18-year-olds. I am not adverse to preventing 18-year-olds from having these firearms. And I want to tell you part of the reason why. Discussions have come up now about this prefrontal cortex lobe of the brain, which is not as developed in 18-year-olds as it is for 25-year-olds. Well, that's a really good point, Paul, but listen to what I'm about to say to you next. Those are the same kids we arm with these weapons with this deficiency in judgment, and we send them off to war, hoping they survive. You understand what we're talking about in this country?
Yes, of course.
I got the memo here. They don't know any better. You know, you could pump smoke up their backsides. I got the whole deal with the military. Trust me, I grew up through generations, Vietnam, etc. I worked with and had the opportunity to have relationships with men from World War II. I got the memo on this one. But if you're telling me that we shouldn't give them an 18 years of age, a weapon that they want to refer to as an assault-style weapon. Of course, that label depends on who's at the argument. Some call it a sporter. I don't really care about all the semantics at this point. But what about this discussion about we allow them to go to war for us? Why are we sending these kids that you're telling me, I don't mean you personally, collectively, we're saying that they don't have the brain development to have the judgment in a situation as stressful as well. That's why they're coming back with the highest suicide rate in the history of the country, or they come back in pieces. You know, there's a gigantic, broader discussion here that once again indicts the system.
Yes.
You know, the issue with mental health, I've been writing this song for over 20 years. I did interviews with Soledad O'Brien and Don Lemon on CNN. This was my proposal. If you want this high-capacity semi-automatic pistol, you think you need the assault rifle, which you're never getting out of the hands of the public. They're already conceding that point. You can listen to the discussions they're having. We're hoping we can get you just to 21 to buy it now. But if you think you need it, here's what I want to do for you. I want to give you a concealed weapons permit that's valid through all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and all U.S. territories, a privilege I have as a retired law enforcement agent. I want you to be psychologically screened, criminally backgrounded, trained, and educated like law enforcement. Minnesota multiphasic screening, which is not what it's called anymore. You can tell me what it's called next. Rorschach, word association, interview psychologists, psychiatrists. Let's at least start to have a conversation that takes us in the right direction. Part of the problem also, like with the red flag laws, it isn't as simple as people make it seem. You know, and I have to be very candid with you. I have firsthand knowledge of instances in which a spouse made an allegation against the other, which was completely untrue, which translated to loss of the firearm. You know, we have a culture that's not perfect, and we abuse a lot of these laws and privileges. So this is a real tricky conversation. I hate to say this to you about this whole conversation going on in the Senate right now. I almost feel like they're trying to create the optic as if they're trying to do their job, because I see no meat and potatoes in what they're discussing. Okay, period, plain and simple. And I just gave you a real good argument about the 18-year-old. You're right. Then stop sending my children to war. Plain and simple. Okay?
Well,
and
I can jump right in and agree with you.
Go ahead,
on
buddy,
that.
go.
I mean, we're having basically an academic discussion here. So I don't
Easy how you label
anything.
me now. Don't brand me, okay? Okay,
I don't
because
expect
I have friends.
in the sense that I don't expect anything that I could say right now that will move military policy, but I'll say a couple of things. The first is I have a deep and abiding respect for the military and anyone who participates in it. I think it's a tremendous sacrifice and a significant commitment. And a lot of my thinking around the military comes from the fact that my father was a Vietnam veteran. He passed away many years ago. He didn't go to Vietnam because he wanted to pick up a gun and go shoot people. He went to Vietnam because he was drafted to go to Vietnam, and he went there unwillingly. And the reason I know that he went there unwillingly is because he never spoke one word about it to me when he returned. And that's despite the fact that as a lieutenant, he earned a Silver Star for what he did in Vietnam. And I've seen the citation, and I can't believe the gallantry and the bravery that he demonstrated while he was there. But he was 18, 19, 20 years old when he was enlisted. And I will say, I don't think that 18-year-olds should be in the military. I don't think 19-year-olds should be, or 20 or 21. Maybe if we can take it all the way up to 25. The research on brain development points to 25 being kind of the watershed year where you have all those judgment capacities really locked into place. So to the extent that we can delay giving guns to kids before that age, I think it's going to be all the better for us. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's realistic, but that is supported by the science. but that's not something that's going to be immediately become policy. But it has made some inroads into, how we think about juvenile justice and culpability and those sorts of things. But that's a separate argument, maybe for another day. But I agree with you. If there was a war right now and a draft was on, and my son was approaching that point where he could be drafted, number one, I'd be talking to him about what a conscientious objector was, and number two, I'd be talking to him about, well, let's look about how we're going to get to Canada or something like that, because I can't send my son to war, and I don't think anybody should be sending their sons to war at that age.
I agree 100% with you, buddy. I look at our foreign policies, and again, we don't want to go off on a tangent about foreign policies that have failed, whether it's Vietnam or Iraq or wherever. The bottom line is stop sending our children to get slaughtered in foreign countries where they hate us. And the other thing that's so interesting about this discussion, like for Vietnam, for example, if you want people to follow you, don't sell them democracy and voting. Take care of their kids. They'll follow you off the ends of the earth if you take care of their children. The whole psychology that's applied by government, not just ours, across this planet, is just wrong in relationships to these wars. I don't understand the necessity of war either. I don't understand his preoccupation with mankind developing weaponry that continues to advance through time, the purpose of which is to annihilate one another. I don't get this defect there is in mankind. And I have to tell you this, I came from a very violent background. I fought in the streets every day. I professionally carried a firearm. I've been protecting people over 50 years. I've carried a firearm for 49 years. Nothing bothers me more. What bothers me more than that is why I have to. I don't know how we get to the place we need to get, but I think if we could get someone, a voice of reason and calm, someone that reaches out, has the ability to reach out to everybody instead of their constituents, which is predicated on their political affiliation and their agenda, it might help us immensely. Why don't we stop lying about these conversations and talk to them truthfully? This is going to affect our children. Look, I told you, Paul, I'm 70. I'm going to hop, skip, and jump through this. You got more years ahead of you than I do, and a lot. I guarantee you got 40 more years of this cuckoo. I don't have 40 years here. I wish I could say I did because I don't want to leave my children, to be honest with you, but I'm being realistic. One of the ways that I think they could start to manage the access of young people to firearms is to try to come to some form of compromise. Let's say, for example, if you want to go bird hunt with your dad, you got to be under the supervision. These little nuances. The weapon has to be of a certain type, a firearm of a certain type, barrel length, magazine capacity, things of that nature. But the contradiction in terms is what we're talking about. We send you off to war with the gun. Oh, yeah, by the way, as they're talking about banning assault rifles here, we're flooding them into Europe right now. Please rest assured that the only people that are not being armed, the populace, isn't the Ukraine. Because everybody that's contiguous to that country, including Finland and Sweden, who've been overtly threatened by Putin about joining NATO, everybody's up on their heels right now. I should say they should be up on their toes. And I guarantee you we're arming people. So rather than continue to batter this around with lawyers, which we're inundated with in Washington, why don't we just sit down and have some commonsensical approach, of which obviously you should be a voice in based on your understanding of the science behind this discussion, which I'm learning about every day. I'm like in a little bit of a catch-up mode, but I'm paying attention here, folks. As far as the military goes, I don't believe in going into foreign countries any longer, especially with the technology we have. Maybe during World War II there was a necessity, there was a need to go in with troops to liberate countries like France or preserve England's autonomy or any other of these countries. But and I know, we can read what you're reading on a park bench, the print from 60,000 feet. Use technology. I don't know what to say to this country, but I just say this to you. The conversation we're having intersects in every area. It lends itself to a lack of leadership, a lack of vision by our media is a big part of this problem. I want to tell you something interesting. The guy's name is Jonathan Capehart. He's a journalist on MSNBC. I watched him on Sunday making references to crazy white people. Now, I just want to know, is that what we're paying journalists to do? Crazy white people. You know what that's predicated on, that belief? How he's afraid of crazy white people and blacks are afraid of crazy white people because they see the color of the country changing. That's hard to argue. The color of the country is changing. I don't know if that's good or bad or if it's just a logical progression. I don't know how to quantify it. I don't want to over-intellectualize it. If we're going to have immigration without going off on a tangent, it's got to be done or managed in an intelligent form, not that you just swim the Rio Grande and you land in our country. But I listen to what comes out of the mouths of our media people, and they're festering this problem. By the way, Don't our children listen to it as well? I'm looking at
Well,
the behavior of big people. Go ahead, buddy.
I do think that kind of terminology can be problematic. I certainly understand where Capehart's coming from in his feelings, but I agree with you that the way in which that kind of message is coming across can be problematic. But it does. But what he's talking about in his inartful terminology is the fact that the white supremacist activity is on the rise.
I got to hold you with that thought for 1 second about white supremacy on the rise. Guys, we're going to take a quick break. You're listening to Between the Lines, and I have with me Dr. Paul Boxer. We're going to be right back, guys. So let me tell you a little bit about Buzzsprout. Very interesting concept. Basically, it allows you to set up your own podcast. One of the most advantageous things about using Buzzsprout is it's user-friendly. So I encourage you highly, if your inclination is to create your own podcast, please look into Buzzsprout. And by the way, we use it. We're back. I have with us today a gentleman, tremendous amount of insight and a problem solver, Dr. Paul Boxer. He is a professor. He teaches at Rutgers University-Newark. He's got quite an extensive background. He's had an interesting educational path. I suggest you research it. But I want to continue on your last comment regarding Mr. Capehart and the concern about white supremacy. Go.
Yeah. So what I think Capehart, I didn't see the segment that you were mentioning, but I would imagine Capehart's referring to is some documented increases in activities of organized white supremacist groups that do appear to have fairly violent ultimate goals around how they interact with communities of color, Black folks and brown folks and Jews and other groups, racial ethnic groups that traditionally have been on the underside of dealing with white supremacist violence. So, again, like I suggested, his terminology may have been inartful. If he was on MSNBC, he might have been speaking to an audience that he might have found welcoming for that. But, that kind of messaging isn't going to change any hearts and minds on the other side. But still, he's referring to a fairly real phenomenon.
And I agree with you. I think that I unfortunately have to tell you the truth, which I am just crazy about telling the truth. I think this is a byproduct of the prior administration. We gave them some sense of validation. I'm not saying that Trump endorsed or furthered their cause, but he gave them some type of purpose here. And this is, again, when I go back, the rhetoric is wrong in the country, Paul. And by the way, our children listen to it. We listen to somebody like Sean Hannity demean, degrade, and defile the president of the United States. This is really simple for me. If the president is malfeasant, nonfeasant, not doing a good job, why don't we intelligently speak to it in a constructive manner? And by the way, while you're slitting his throat rhetorically, offer some solutions instead of banging his head against the wall. What's so interesting about this, though, is that when Trump was in, the more liberal media outlets did it to him, and now we've got a Democrat in, and now Sean Hannity and Tucker Carlson are doing it. This is, again, going to go into a conversation at some point, not today, about oversight with the media, because there doesn't seem to be any. Mm-hmm. But I have to say one thing. The comments that came out of Capehart's mouth were polarizing, and it fuels and feeds the agenda. I don't know what we're missing in this country as far as the importance of leadership and your responsibility. I feel like they live in a damn bubble, and they've been so far away from the mainstream of America, including our children, that they can't guide us. And I think that's what we're looking for today, some sensibility, some guidance. Make sense of this thing. Before I give you the floor, I read this thing, this little precursor to some Senate agreement about mental health and funding. Where's the money coming from, and who are you giving it to? And just don't tell me you're giving me money. Tell me the mechanism. Right, Paul? Which you can probably create for them in case they're interested in knowing it. I yield the floor.
Yeah, what I was going to say was, one of the big problematic byproducts of the fact that the conversation is polarized in that way is that you don't typically hear either side talking about the kinds of commonalities that both sides, I shouldn't say both sides, that the constituency of both sides can really support in terms of moving forward. And I'll try to stay tied to the children's mental health and health issues. I mean, you don't hear the rhetoric that we actually need to hear about to kind of move us forward. You don't hear the leadership talking about things like, let's at a minimum, let's guarantee that every single child who needs access to mental health services gets it easily. Or at a minimum, let's guarantee that there is not going to be a single child in this country who shows up for school in the morning not having had anything to eat and doesn't have to make it through the day without getting a lunch provided to them. There have been bills in Congress to do things like provide universal school lunches, seems pretty simple. Let everybody have access to free lunch or free and reduced cost lunch. Then nobody has to feel stigmatized about needing it because everybody's getting it. I mean, there's simple, common kinds of things.
But Paul, let me just say one thing to you about that, because you brought up something very interesting. Legislation that's focused or directed towards our children should be addressed independently in the House and the Senate and the President, not commingle and build back better your immigration laws. That's part of what's going on here. I understand the whole pork belly spending skit. That's a very novel concept that they're employing here. Meanwhile, our homeless suffer, our elderly suffer, our veterans suffer because you're trying to piggyback your bullshit in plain English into a law that's going to be very difficult to pass. This is what's wrong with this country. And for most people see, this is the issue I have. We're so damn distracted by your Tesla and your generation of cell phone that we're not seeing the forest for the trees here. Any legislation regarding our children, and no child should want. You're born in this country, that's what we pay taxes for. Take care of our children first and foremost, okay? Should never be commingled in any legislation independent of that designed to aid them. This is ridiculous what we're doing. It's why we don't get anywhere. I listened to them say that, you know, the Republicans are blocking funding for something for the inner city. Yeah, but you put it in an immigration bill. Immigration's a separate discussion. I mean, you know what it is? They capitalize on the fact we're just plain not paying attention, Paul. That's part of the problem here. But I want to ask you this. Have you focused in on any research regarding the media and its effect on children? Have you gone down that avenue, you know, specifically?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Would you care?
Sure. There's quite a large literature showing that exposure to violence in the media can be very problematic for kids. Whether it's, I mean, mostly, you know, when we're talking about that kind of research now, a lot of it's being done with violent video games and internet sort of content. But the research on violent media goes back to the 1960s in terms of looking at kids' television show preferences and how those preferences relate to their aggressive behavioral development. So we have research from studies that have been done in the field, conducted over a period of years. We have research from studies that have been done in the laboratory. And we know fairly confidently that when you have kids exposed to violent media, whether they're watching it in a TV show or a film, or whether they're engaging in it in a video game, the research does suggest that there are both short and long-term impacts on the kids' aggressive behavior.
So I got another question for you. You ready? Why isn't someone like you or your colleagues ever invited to the House, the Senate, or a symposium involving the media that we can speak to these topics so we can get this back on track, or at least guide these knuckleheads into a path of travel that lends itself to the betterment of our children, hopefully reducing this propensity towards gun violence?
Well, we have been. I mean, not me personally. I mean, although I have done some research, I've given some presentations to the Centers for Disease Control, which funded one of our studies years ago. But I have colleagues who are experimental social psychologists who have done a lot of this research directly themselves, who have testified to Congress about their findings. Their findings have been presented in all kinds of places. And in fact, you know, one of the reports that we like to cite often to sort of remind people about the time frame that we're talking about here, I believe it was 1972 when the U.S. Surgeon General was so convinced at that point by the research that had been done that he essentially said kids shouldn't be watching violent TV because violent TV causes increased aggressive behavior. I mean, this is back in the early 70s.
Goes back to parenting, though, Paul.
For a while.
Right, but Paul, let's go back to the real. This is where I really think the fundamental addressment lies. It has to do with failed parenting. I see it every day. I saw it in law enforcement. I saw it growing up. I take my children to school. I witness it when I look at these kids come on the campuses. They look like unmade beds. And then I have to hear stories about how they smoke and pop before they went to school or drinking alcohol. Guess what, guys? If you don't want to parent children, don't have them. I just want to ask you this. So after your colleagues go through this painstaking trouble of addressing the powers to be, is it received? Does it make any difference? Do we go anywhere with it, Paul? Are we just, going in a circle here?
Well, it's interesting that you make the point about parenting. I mean, parents are certainly very relevant in terms of thinking about the ways in which violent media can be, distributed and shown to kids, right? Parents do have a responsibility to be aware of the kinds of content that their kids are accessing and consuming. It's neither parenting nor violent media independently will suffice to create the kinds of issues that you're talking about. They're both, risk factors in a broader matrix. But in terms of the net outcomes of my colleagues having testified to Congress, there haven't been changes at the policy level. it's impossible to move, as far as I can tell, it's impossible to move the entertainment industry. But at least one impact has been more information getting out there. There's some great web resources for this. Common Sense Media is an excellent one, where parents can access information about the content that's out there and can make informed decisions about what they will and will not let their kids have access to. So there's been some impact on that level. But Supreme Court cases have suggested that any attempts to control violent media access could potentially be construed as censorship. So we haven't had a lot of movement on that.
Wouldn't it be novel if they just did it for the sake of doing it? I look at a lot of problems in the country. I talk about, for example, how to eliminate the disparity in which the minorities live. And, no one wants to talk about socialism, which I agree with 100%. I think the government should fund it because you're going to need a lot of money in bodies. But I also think that corporate America should voluntarily participate and contribute without being mandated to, because the mandating lends itself to socialism. I got the memo here, folks. But if I'm listening to the numbers that are correct about how much Exxon made, $35 billion in profit the first quarter, guys, give me a break here. No disrespect to Tesla or Bezos about going into space. I could do better things with that money. I want to say this again, and this pops up all the time now. I heard $53 billion invested into the Ukraine. What we could do with $53 billion here in reinventing minority communities and in general addressing the needs of indigent children would astound people. But for some reason, our priorities are all wrong. I don't know how we have billions of dollars to give to adversarial countries like Pakistan. I guess we keep them in a peaceful state or friendly towards us, but we don't have the money for our own people. And, when you and I are talking about this, and you're right, this conversation has to continue, which is why I asked you to come back from last week. I got warmed up with you last week. I don't know if you know that. I had to get a real grasp on where I could go with you because I want to take you everywhere you need to go with this thing. I want to ask you before I forget, have you written any books, Dr. Boxer?
I have not. I've written lots of academic papers and book chapters. I have a colleague at Texas State University. We're editing a volume right now on youth violence, but I have not authored a book, no.
So if we Google you and youth violence, will they be able to?
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
That's my point. So if the listeners are listening, excuse me, sir.
Everyone in my position typically now has a profile on Google Scholar where everything's lined up nicely.
Perfect. So our listeners can understand if you Google this gentleman's name, probably youth gun violence, it'll pop up. And what's that other Google Scholar? Is that what it's referred to?
Google Scholar, yeah.
Google Scholar. I'm not the most computer literate guy, so just indulge me.
No problem.
I think this has to be a bigger and broader conversation and one that bears fruit because nothing we're doing today is fixing anything. And I don't care what topic it's involved. I mean, there's nothing more critical to me than our children. They're entitled to something better than we're giving them. They're entitled to a future. I also feel for the young people like yourself. Like I said, I'm going to hop, skip, and jump through this thing. I am so well versed in how to navigate and understand this culture. It troubles me at times, but it allows me to problem solve also because I'm able to see something and get past and get into the subtext as to what's really driving this. That's why I made this comment to you, Paul, about these Senate hearings and these agreements that are coming through. I almost feel like they're just trying to make the public think they're doing something to earn their money because I don't see any real substance here, guys.
I mean, I would love to know. I mean, the next step, in kind of the conversation we're having is I would love to know how we can more effectively get the science that is out there to move public policy. I mean, I can tell you, Lou, that if we're talking about some of these big picture issues like poverty, okay, we as child development researchers, psychologists, social scientists, et cetera, we've known for decades, we've had data for decades showing that poverty adversely impacts child development in a variety of different ways. It affects brain development, it affects physical health, it affects mental health, academics, everything. We know that encounters with violence in the neighborhood, in the community, and on TV, that also negatively impacts child development. We know that poor access to mental health care or physical health care.
What about What about the pandemic? If you're an only child in a family, I had 4, and I have to be honest with you. My wife and I set the tone. It was no big deal, not the end of the world. My children hop, skipped, and jumped through it. None of the adverse effects I hear other children experienced. But I can only imagine being polarized as an only child in a family where all of a sudden you're cut off from your relatives, your schoolmates, any stimulus in the academic environment, or any stimulus with the exception of this idiot box, right, the television, and social media. Can you imagine the damage that could do to a child? But we don't talk about it, Paul, we don't talk about it in this damn country.
And I think my point is, so yeah, we're going to end up with years worth of data showing over the next few years, we'll see lots of studies coming out showing the negative effects of the pandemic and the lockdowns. And my point is, we've had these scientific findings for years. We've got good research, Lou, on the ways in which to reduce gun violence and gun crimes, related.
So
to
how do we get them out there, though, boss? Tell me.
That's what I'm asking. That's what I'm saying. Like, I think the next leap is, how do we take the science and really ensure that it can inform policy and practice? And I'm not a politician. I think I'd be a terrible politician if I had to become one. I don't know how to move these folks. I mean, I think on the local level, you can have some changes. We've had some amazing things happen in New Jersey locally, at the municipal level, the county level, the state level, on some of these kinds of issues. And we've had some pretty good leadership in the past couple of years here in New Jersey. But we're talking about, some of these things can only happen at the federal level, and I don't know how to make those folks, jump and get, ask them to jump and have them say how high.
Guys, we're going to take a quick break. Dr. Boxer, we're going to come back to you in 1 second. Just stick with us, guys. We're back, ladies and gentlemen. I have with me today, again, fortunately, Dr. Paul Boxer is a professor at Rutgers Newark. He's just involved in a lot of very positive things, perhaps most significant, and there's nothing more important. He's concerned about our children, this propensity with guns and violence, and we've had a real interesting discussion. It intersects with other issues in our country, obviously. I want to just say, Paul, this to you. I have a show Monday and Tuesday, 5 to 6, that's live in Jacksonville. Goes to Orlando, goes to Charleston. I'd love to have you on and give you a whole hour as we're having right now so people can start to hear what we're talking about, because I think the problem is not enough people are exposed to your train of thought, to the solution to the problem. We're hearing and finger pointing. We want to make everybody believe if we wave the magic wand and the gun goes away, suddenly the mental health with our children is better. That's just not the case. And a lot of these kids, if it isn't just the fact that they're reverting or resorting to firearms to carry out their aggressions, their frustrations, their insecurities, their deficiencies, the quality of their life is terrible in general. And I hate to go back and say this to you, but I start with this discussion with failed parenting, and then it just kind of blossoms from there about the social media today and the lack of monitoring by the parent, the video games by the parent. Let me say something else to you, Paul. To be 100% truthful, I know you're a parent. I'm all aware of this thing called a forbidden fruit. I've had firearms in my home. I never hid them from my son. My son handles firearms more responsibly than most adults, A, because I taught him how to do so, and B, because he has no curiosity. I did the same thing with the video game. There's no way to harness these kids at 11 and 12 and 13 years old when they want to get their hands on what's that one game that there's two that are Lulu's. Grand Theft Auto, for example, right? You create the forbidden fruit. I bet, you know what? Let me give you the damn thing. You went through it, and I said, Dylan, let me just explain something about life. This journey's not about hurting people. It's about healing people, protecting people. That's what your dad has done for over 50 years. I protected people. He willingly abandoned them. He went through his cycle with them, saw the lack of merit, and he abandoned them on his own, which is, I don't know how to tell parents how to manage this. It's quite tricky. We got about a minute, Paul. I want to give you the final minute, sir.
Well, I guess I could say it's been a great conversation. It's been very wide-ranging. And, these are the kinds of issues that folks in my position try to really, when we're doing our science, when we're doing studies, we can circumvent them a little bit because we want to find out a fairly limited answer to a limited question, but everything connects, as you suggested. I mean, violence is a multi-causal kind of phenomenon. It relates to poverty, it relates to health, it relates to general well-being, it relates to all kinds of things when we're talking about, the developing child. So the solutions will never be perfectly straightforward, and they can never happen just in one sector. We do need lots of changes in lots of different levels to kind of move that needle. So it's been great to have this conversation. I love hearing the perspectives from folks who are outside the discipline, looking in and answering these kinds of questions and talking about these kinds of issues. So I've appreciated the chance to go through some of this with you.
I appreciate you coming back on, and I just want to say, you and I are part of the solution. That's the exercise in here is leaving this place better than when we got here.
Absolutely.
Cannot thank you enough. You're always welcome back. I encourage you, if you're so inclined, we can set this up that you can be on this live show, and I want to run through a lot of this. I want people to start to hear there's something other than what we're being, I would say, provided by elected officials and media outlets. And that's it. You know, I don't know what else to say to you except thank you. And
right.
I hope we have further conversation on this. I know we're going to be back in touch again, hopefully
Thank you.
not
I'll
too
look forward
soon.
to that.
Likewise, Paul. Thank you so much, Dr. Boxer.
All
Hope to
right.
see you guys
Bye-bye.
again. Guys, I think that's it for today. This conversation, I hope you found rather stimulating and insightful. And, you know, this provides a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel here. And it's a long, dark tunnel. But if you listen to this young man, he has the ability to help us navigate through a very critical and sensitive problem: our youth, the violence, and the gun issue in this country. That's kind of it, folks. This has been Between the Lines. My name is Lou Palumbo. I do want to remind you of something. You can find us at betweenthelines.tv. Email me, call me, send a pigeon. I don't care how you communicate. Just get involved in this conversation. We've got to take this country in a different direction, if for no other reason, because of our children. Thanks so much today, guys. I appreciate it.